Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I will be explaining and demonstrating the leveling process, which is the main focus of this section of the tutorial. This is going to be a longer video, but I provide a lot of tips and explain my decisions with some pretty important commentary. This is a very important video for this section of the tutorial, so I really recommend you watch through the whole thing. Essentially, the leveling process is where you set the levels of each of your sounds so that they are all at an appropriate loudness. Nothing is too loud and nothing is too quiet. Now, there's no right or wrong way to do this. It really doesn't matter how you go about the leveling process, as long as the end result is a good sounding and well-balanced mix. That said, I will be showing you and explaining to you one particular way to go about the leveling process in this video. This method is a very popular method that is often mentioned in mixing tutorials. It really makes a lot of sense to me, and I've had a lot of success mixing this way, so I think that you will as well. So here's the example I will be using in this video, the song that I will be kind of mixing with leveling. And you can hear right now that all the levels are pretty off, but we're going to fix that. Now, the first thing you want to do is find the fullest or most important section of your track. Basically the part that has the most sounds playing together at one time. So in dubstep or big room house, this would probably be the drop. It could be the climax or anticlimax in hardstyle. Or in pop music, it might be the chorus or the hook. But essentially just the section that has the most sounds playing together at one time, and usually that's going to be kind of the most important section of the song. So this song kind of has two different drops, and in between the drops there's not a whole lot of sound going on. There's kind of just the piano building up into the drop. So that's kind of the first drop, and then the second drop happens here. And you can hear that the second drop just has a lot more going on in it than the first. So this is the fullest section in this track. And when you know what section that is in your track, you want to set your playlist to start from the beginning of that section, and this is where you will start mixing. The reason you want to do this is because focusing on the fullest section first ensures that you don't end up with any problems later on. You've already made this really full section with all these different sounds work as far as mixing goes, and so you don't have to worry about running into a different section later where you have to squeeze in even more sounds, when you may not have left enough room for them in the mix. And you just don't have to worry about that because no other section will be as full as what you've already mixed. And that's why I highly recommend you start by mixing the fullest section first. So I'm just going to highlight this section. And that's kind of where I'm going to start off mixing. So once you know where you're going to start mixing, the next thing you want to do is simply make sure that all of your sounds are routed through the mixer. And if you see my mixer here, I've already done this. All of my sounds are routed through the mixer. And if I turn all of these off, then you can hear nothing's playing. So all of my sounds are routed to the mixer, and you just want to make sure that all of your sounds are routed to the mixer as well. And usually you want each sound to have its own mixer track. The possible exception being if you have certain sounds that are layered together. So like this snare track, for example, has a clap and a snare that are layered, but they're both routed through the snare track instead of being separate. So with layered sounds, it's going to be a matter of personal preference whether you send each layer to its own track to process independently or send them to the same track to process as a whole. But basically you just want all your sounds sent through the mixer so that you can adjust the levels of them using the level faders. And once you have all of your sounds routed to their own tracks, you want to zero all of your level faders. And by this I mean that you want to take the level of each fader on each used mixer track all the way down so that all of your sounds are silenced. So I'm just going to take each of these mixer faders down, and I'll be right back. So you can see that now I have zeroed all of my faders. All of my faders are at minus infinity decibels, or all the way at the bottom. And if I play the track, you'll hear nothing right now. So you could see when I played that, you didn't hear any sound, and that's pretty much what you want. The reason you want to do this is because starting from silence, having all of your tracks zeroed, allows you to build your mix from the ground up and set each sound at just the right level more easily and objectively. And the last thing you want to do before getting started with the real mixing is make sure that your master track is set up properly. You don't want any effects on your master track that will change the sound of your mix. So you don't want any active EQ, you don't want a compressor or a sound goodizer, a sausage fattener, or anything like that on your master while you're mixing, while you're setting the levels. And the reason for this is because you want full control over the sounds while you mix. If you have any effects on the master track that are changing the sound, you are giving away some of this control, because any mixing decisions you try to make may be restricted by these effects on the master. And in some cases, you may end up not being able to achieve the results you want to because of this. And having effects on the master while mixing can also make mastering less effective later on. And this isn't a rule or anything, there's no right or wrong way to do it. This is just something that I really recommend because, without any effects on the master, you do have complete control during the mixing stage. You can set a sound to be exactly as loud as you want it to be, and it won't be affected by any compression that you might have on the master. So if you're a beginner, I definitely recommend you just start off this way, and you might find that something else works better for you later on. But I think it would be a smart way for you to start off just with, not really any effects that are changing the sound on the master. But there is one effect that I do kind of recommend you have on the master, and that is a limiter. So I'm going to add the Fruity limiter, and the limiter ceiling should be set at 0 decibels. It's just here to prevent any unexpected loudness from damaging your speakers or your ears. So the limiter is not going to affect anything that's below 0 decibels, and while we're mixing, nothing should be exceeding 0 decibels unless it's an accident. And this just helps protect, the speakers and our ears and all that. So in addition to the limiter, you can have any monitoring plugins that you want on the master. So I personally like to have a span on the master track, which is just a spectrum analyzer. And then I also like to have a Wave Candy set to my custom spectrogram. And sometimes I'll have a vector scope as well, if I'm mixing with headphones and really want to get the stereo image, make sure I'm not too wide or anything. So these tools just give me a visual representation of what's happening with my mix, which can be helpful at times. And you can use whatever monitoring plugins you think would be helpful. I definitely recommend at least a spectrum analyzer or a spectrogram, if not both. But maybe you'd prefer to use neither. It just depends on whether you find them helpful or not. And if you're wondering why I have two other things on the master, it's just for recording purposes. The EQ is to help with the recording, and Edison is doing the audio recording for while I'm recording this video. So at this point, if you were doing reference mixing, you would want to bring in your reference track and set it at an appropriate level if you hadn't already. And I'm not going to be doing reference mixing in this video, but I will be covering it in depth later in the section of the tutorial. I highly recommend reference mixing for beginners, so definitely watch those videos before jumping into practicing, because reference mixing is really, really helpful for beginners. And in those videos I'll show you how to bring in the reference track and how to use that reference track. So once you've done all of this, you're ready to get started with the actual leveling process. And do keep in mind that I'm going to be doing this mix quickly and in my headphones, so I won't be trying to get a perfect mix or anything. And instead of trying to mix perfectly, I'll be focusing more on the explanation and the demonstration of how I set my levels and how I think about things while mixing. And that's what I want you to pay attention to in this video, more so than how I actually set the levels. Because this mix might end up pretty rough, just because I am going to be going through it quickly and not really double checking it or anything. So now we're ready to get on with the actual leveling process. So now the first thing you want to do is set the level of your kick. The reason I like to start with the kick is because the drums provide the rhythmic foundation, or the metronome, in a track, and the kick is kind of the heart of the drums. Even if you are singing the lyrics or the melody, you are probably dancing to the drums, especially the kick and snare, more than anything. Because of this, you usually want your drums to cut through the mix really well, and the easiest way of achieving this is to start with the drums, and then mix in all of your other sounds around them. If you happen to be mixing a song that doesn't have any drums, you would want to start with the most important element of the song. And this would probably be the vocals or the main instrument. So how loud should you set your kick? Well, if you're using a reference track, you would set the level of your kick to match the loudness of the kick in the reference track. Otherwise, set it at a level that provides you with plenty of headroom. Headroom is essentially the difference between the peaking level of your track and 0 decibels. Some people will say you need a certain amount of headroom, but it doesn't really matter that much. Just as long as you have some buffer between your peaks and 0 decibels, you should be fine, because the main reason you want this headroom is so that you aren't clipping the master or pushing into that limiter that we have on the master while mixing. So setting the kick to be at a peaking level of -8 decibels or lower should provide you with plenty of headroom. If your drums are going to be less loud compared to the rest of your mix, you might want to go lower, but if you plan to have louder drums, -8 should be fine. If you want to be on the safe side, you might go with -10 instead. But in this recording, in this example, I'm going to go with about -9. So I've brought the level of the kick up, and you can see that it's peaking right about -9. The specific number doesn't really matter. You just want it low enough that you maintain some amount of headroom as you continue to mix your other sounds in. This might be a lot more quiet than you're used to, and if it does sound too quiet, all you have to do is turn up your monitors or headphones until things sound loud enough again. So if you're using ASIO for all, you could turn up your PC sound, but just, whatever way you're able to turn up the volume outside of FL Studio is what you would need to do. Now, you do want to avoid mixing at too high of a level. You just want things loud enough so that you can hear everything pretty well. So things shouldn't be super quiet, but they also shouldn't be super loud. Because having things too loud makes it harder to be objective with your mixing. So now that you have your kick level set, you want to start setting the levels of your other sounds one at a time. And you want to base the levels of each sound on the sounds that are already present in the mix. If you are reference mixing, you can use the reference track as a guideline as well. So after the kick, I like to bring in the snare or clap, followed by the rest of the drums one at a time, and then all of the other sounds in order of importance. The reason I like to get all of my drums in first is because, like I said before, the drums really provide the rhythmic foundation of a track, and usually you want them to cut through the mix really well. And just mixing everything in around your drums really helps you get your drums to cut through the mix. You don't have to follow this order if you think another order will work better for you, but I definitely find that this works best for me, and it does seem like a lot of people do it this way as well, because it works for them. So as I said, after the kick, I like to set the level of the snare. And so I'm just going to bring up that level fader until it sounds like the snare is at a good loudness level relative to the kick. How loud that is will depend on my personal taste as well as the style of music. If you're using a reference track, that can help you as a guideline. But it's really up to you. What sounds good to you? How loud should it be compared to the kick? And if you are a beginner, like I said before, I definitely recommend reference mixing, because it will help you get a better idea of how relatively loud all the sounds are in tracks that you really like the mixes of. It will also just help you get more familiar with how good mixes sound on the headphones or monitors that you will be using for mixing. So now I'll just set the level of that snare. That sounds pretty good to me. And don't worry too much about whether your sounds are at the perfect level when you first bring them in, because none of these decisions have to be final. You do want to get your levels as close to perfect as possible, so that you are building a good foundation. But there's nothing wrong with making some adjustments later on if you feel the need to. So start off by trying to get your levels about right, but don't obsess too much over these initial leveling decisions. I've been mixing for a while, and it's still pretty common for me to go back and make some changes later on. And it's really not a problem or anything. Now, the way I decide what order to bring in the rest of the drums after the kick and the snare is based on their importance to the rhythm. The kick and snare make up the foundation, but there can be certain other percussive sounds that give the beat a more specific groove. And I want the drums that really provide this groove to be heard well, so I start with them first and then work my way to the rest of the drums. So the next sound I'll bring in will be this offbeat percussive sound. And you can hear that it really adds quite a bit of character to the groove of that drum beat. Without it, it sounds pretty different. So, anything like that really adds to the groove of the drum beat is kind of the, what I would bring in earlier regarding the drums, and then I'd bring in the other ones later. So you want to keep in mind that your kick and snare should probably be the loudest drums in a track. In house music, your snare might not be so loud because it hits with the kick, but that kick should be the loudest drum sound. So when you set the levels of your other drums, you probably don't want them quite as loud as the kick or the snare. If you do want loud present drums other than the kick and the snare, they would probably be just slightly less loud. But if you want those other drum sounds to be a bit softer or more subtle, you would probably want them to be a fair bit quieter than the kick or the snare. So which style of drums you go with is up to you, but either way, in most cases, nothing should be overpowering that kick or the snare. So I'm just going to, set this to a level that I think is good. So that sounds okay to me. And now I'll bring in this percussive sound that enhances the first offbeat hit. So that's this sound here. And that kind of adds to the groove quite a bit as well. So that's what I'll be bringing in next. So that sounds pretty good to me right there. Now you'll notice that aside from when I was setting the kick, I haven't really been giving you any specific peak levels or ranges for the different sounds. And the reason for this is, as I've explained in previous videos in this section of the tutorial, the peak readings and even RMS readings are largely useless for setting your sounds to be at the right loudness. I don't really pay any attention to my peak meters while setting the loudness of my sounds, and I don't even use RMS meters at all while mixing, for the most part. Now, as a beginner, you probably do want some sort of guideline to help you set your different sounds at the right levels, but looking for specific peak or RMS values to set each sound at is really not going to be practical. The guideline you would want to use is a good reference track. And like I said, I will be explaining reference mixing in a bit more depth later in this section of the tutorial. So I did just want to mention this again because a lot of beginners seem to want to find a guide for mixing that will tell them to set their various sounds at specific peaking levels or specific RMS levels. They want something easy that just says to set their kick at -8 decibels and then set their snare to peak at -7 and so on. But mixing really just doesn't work like that. So the best guideline you can have is a good reference track. And then, using that reference track in addition to some spectrum analyzers can, help you out quite a bit if you need some sort of a guideline, which as a beginner you probably do. So, the best guideline you can have is a good reference track. And now I'll get back to setting the levels of the rest of the drums. So I have most of my drum sounds mixed in, and the last one I want to mix in now is this crash cymbal. But I wanted to talk about crash cymbals a bit because I don't always treat them the same way. Crash cymbals can be used a couple of different ways in electronic music. One way is as a transitional effect. They can be used during a build-up or to emphasize the downbeat after a transition. And the other way is as part of the drum beat. In this case, they're used more as they would be in rock music or jazz music or other styles of non-electronic music, and end up playing a decent role in the actual drum beat. And in each of these cases, I will mix the crash cymbal in differently. If the crash is being used as a transition effect, I will not mix it in with the drums and will instead wait until I'm mixing in my other transition effects, which is towards the end of my mixing process. However, if the crash is being used as part of the drum beat, I will mix it in with the drums. And sometimes a crash can kind of play both of these roles, but usually it will be easy to decide which role it kind of plays more. So in this track, if I bring that level up some, you can hear that this crash does act more as part of the drum beat than as a big transition effect. So I will be mixing it in now with the drums. But I do have another crash and even a gong that are transition effects in this song, and those will be mixed in later. But right now, I'm just going to set the level of this crash. Now that this crash is set, my drum beat is all mixed in. So at this point, I recommend you quickly double check your drums and make sure that they are right about where you want them to be. Make sure nothing stands out too much compared to the rest of the drums, and also make sure that nothing is too quiet compared to the rest of your drums. The reason you want to double check your drums once they're all mixed in is because your drums act as the foundation for the rest of your mix, and it's important to have a solid foundation. And your drums should make a good foundation because they have low frequencies, mid frequencies, and high frequencies. So after you've double checked your drums, you're ready to move on to the other sounds. The first sound I like to bring in after the drums is usually the bass. And the main reason for this is because most of the music I make kind of features the bass as a very important element in the track. So mixing the bass in right after the drums allows me to hear the bass more clearly as I mix it in to make sure it relates well to the kick. It also helps me make sure that the bass comes through clearly and isn't muffled or anything by other sounds in the song as I bring those in. Occasionally, when I make other types of music where the bass isn't as important, I might mix in other sounds first and mix the bass in later. But even in those cases, I mix in the bass first a lot of the time, and maybe that's just because it's what I've gotten used to. And since bass is a big part of the music I make most of the time, I usually mix it in right after the drums. And sometimes you might not have a bass to mix in at this point because your kick is your bass. This will be the case with hardstyle kicks, big room house kicks, and some 808s. So for those tracks, you just move on to the next sound. But I'm just going to bring in that bass right now. And sometimes it can be helpful. I mentioned that you didn't really want any effects on your master track, but sometimes for just isolating specific frequency ranges, it can be nice to have an EQ. and then high pass or low pass depending on what you want to isolate. So if you want to make sure the high end sounds good, you could high pass and listen to the high frequencies. And then if you want to check the low end, you could do the opposite. So I do this quite a bit while mixing in my bass, just to make sure that it fits well with the kick and that the bottom end of my kick sounds the way I want it to with that bass, and the bass isn't too loud, and all that kind of stuff. It just really helps to isolate those low frequencies. So I'm going to do this while I set the level of that bass. And of course you want to make sure it sounds good without that EQ on as well. So I will have an EQ like this on my master, but most of the time it's off, and I just turn it on whenever I want to check a specific frequency range. But yeah, so you just want to make sure that it sounds good without that EQ as well. And just toggling that EQ can help you make sure that the low end sounds how you want it to. Because sometimes the bass isn't super powerful on headphones or monitors, and isolating it like that can help you get a better idea of how it sounds. So that sounds about right to me for the bass. And for bass, you really want to make sure it's not too loud compared to other sounds in your mix, even in bass-heavy genres like dubstep or trap. It's a very common mistake for people to mix their bass too loud, so it's important to watch out for that. And like I keep saying, if you're unsure how loud your bass should be, using a reference track should really help you out with that. Now that I have my bass set, I'm going to bring in my main lead instrument, which in this track is the piano. If I were mixing a song with vocals in it, and the vocals were the focus of that song, I would probably mix in the vocals at this point instead, and then bring in the main lead, because usually you really want the vocals to be heard well. But since there are no vocals in this track, I'll just be mixing in the main lead, which is the piano. So that sounds pretty good to me. You want your main sounds to be pretty loud and present in the mix, but at the same time, you don't want them to overpower your drums. So if you're unsure how loud exactly to set your vocal or main instruments compared to the drums, my advice to you would be to err on the side of making them a little bit too quiet instead of making them a little bit too loud. And there are a couple reasons I recommend this. One reason is simply because it's a nice way to ensure that your drums will cut through the mix well. I'd rather have my leads or my vocals a little bit too quiet with nice loud drums than have the leads or vocals too loud and overpowering those drums and covering them up a bit. A mix with louder drums and softer leads, even if the leads are softer than you'd like, will generally sound pretty good on a loud system, like a club system. But the opposite will not sound very good. And another reason is because of mastering. You don't want to rely entirely on mastering to make your song sound good. Ideally, your song should sound amazing without mastering. But you should consider it as you mix, especially as a beginner, because you're probably not going to be getting amazing mixes for a little while. And if you happen to get a release, mastering will be necessary to make your song sound closer to how it should. So if you mix certain parts in certain ways, mastering can be a bit more effective. But if you make certain mistakes while mixing, mastering just won't be able to fix them at all. So if your leads overpower your drums, it's pretty unlikely that mastering could fix this very well. But if your leads or vocals are a bit too quiet compared to the drums, then good use of compression while mastering can actually bring those leads or vocals up a bit compared to the drums. Obviously, it's best to have your sounds at the right loudness to begin with, but this is part of why I recommend you err on the side of making those lead sounds or vocals, instrument sounds in general, too quiet compared to the drums if you are unsure. So if I play this again, you can hear that the piano is pretty loud and present in the mix, but it doesn't overpower the drums. And that's pretty much what you want. Exactly how loud the main sounds should be compared to the drums will greatly depend on the style of music you're making and your personal preference. So now I'm just going to bring in the rest of the main instrument sounds. So those are all my main sounds, and now I'm going to bring in my pad and effect sounds, kind of the background sounds. And with sounds like these, you usually don't want them to be too loud. Depending on what the sounds are, and depending on your preference, you may want them to be heard more, or you may want them to be very subtle. And with these sounds, I would also recommend erring on the side of making them too quiet instead of too loud, for similar reasons as I mentioned before. So I'm going to start with this string sound, and I really want it to be mostly subtle. This is a sound that you might not even realize is there if you were asked to say which instruments make up the song, but it does fill out the sound and makes everything sound a little bit bigger even though it is very subtle. So I want it to be just loud enough that you notice it while not being very loud at all. The next sound I'm going to bring in is this bubbly effect here. And I want this one to be a little bit more present and noticeable in the mix, so I'll set it at a level that allows it to be fairly noticeable while not distracting from the main sounds. And finally, I want to mix in this other sound that I want to kind of sit on top of everything in the mix and fill out the high end a little bit more. That's this sound here. So this section of my song is completely mixed now, except for transition effects, which is what I will be doing next. Some people say they have trouble mixing in transition effects, but I think the main problem is usually that they're trying to mix these in too loudly. They want a nice big transition, and because of this, they end up making their transition effects too loud. So, of course, they can't get it to sit right in the mix with EQ or compression or anything else, because the main problem is that, the transition effect is simply too loud. So, if you ever find you're having trouble with transition effects, I'd recommend always see if they sound any better if you mix them in at a lower level. And I think that could help in many cases. So I'll mix these transition effects in now. Now, at this point, this section of the song is completely mixed. And I can finally move on to mixing the other sections in the song. So from here, I just want to go to each section of the song and mix in all of the sounds in that section and move to the next until I've gone through the whole song and mixed in every sound. The order I like to go to the different sections in is from fullest to least full. So at the beginning of this video, I recommend that you start mixing with the fullest or most important section of your song, which in this case is this bit here. And so, once I've done this section, I want to move to the second most full section of the song, which is going to be the first drop. And then once I do that, I want to move to the third, fullest section, and then so on until every sound is mixed in. So I'll be moving to that first drop now. And this particular song doesn't actually have too much left to be mixed in the other sections. You can hear when I play the first drop, it's already all mixed in, with the exception of a transition sound. And this is just because that the second drop contains most of the sounds that play throughout the whole track. So sometimes this is how your tracks will be, but other times you might have a fair bit more to do after you finish mixing that first section. Usually though, you will have at least some sounds in the different sections of your track that you mixed in already while mixing that original section, and you can use those sounds as guidelines for setting the levels of the new sounds you have to mix in. but it's always a good idea to double check the levels of any important new sounds, such as new leads that weren't in the other section, against that section that you originally mixed, to make sure that the overall loudness of each section is where it should be compared to the other sections. For example, you usually wouldn't want your intro or build up to be greatly louder than your drop or anything like that. So to finish mixing this song, I only have a few more transition effects to mix in. So I will do that now. And this transition here is a good example of what I was talking about earlier. It's a pretty big transition and covers the entire frequency spectrum. So I kind of expected it to be a little bit tough to mix it in. I ended up playing around with EQ and stuff for a while, but in the end what made it sit right in the mix was simply setting it at the right level. You can see that I have an EQ on it, but all I'm doing with that is high passing the bass out. And just having it at the right level was more important than anything. So I'm just going to set that at the right level now. Okay, so that sounds about right to me. And in this break to build up section after that, you can see I have a couple more effects that I haven't mixed in yet. And this is a reverse gong and a reverse chime. So I'm going to mix those in now. And then finally I'll mix in these chimes. So that sounds pretty good. And now I've mixed in everything that's in the second drop, everything that's in the first drop, and everything that's in this transition section here. So the only song sections I have left are the intro and the outro. And both of these are already fully mixed in. And that's just because they have so few sounds, and the sounds that they do have are played in the other sections I've already mixed. So now I'm done. At this point, I would look through my mixer to make sure that I didn't accidentally miss mixing in any sounds. And it would be easy to tell if I had, because the level fader on any sound I missed would still be all the way down. And you can see that none of these level faders are all the way down. So I did not miss any sounds. Everything's mixed in. But if I scrolled through this and found a fader that was all the way down, I'd need to figure out where that sound plays in the mix and mix it in. Now, the leveling process seems pretty simple and straightforward, but I am often surprised with how many people actually don't have it down while trying to learn other parts of mixing. They're trying to figure out what EQ or compression settings will make their song sound good, when the biggest problem in their song is that the levels of their different sounds are just all over the place. Their synths might be overpowering the drums, their bass may be way too loud or way too quiet, or they may have any number of different issues with their levels. And EQ and compression just aren't going to fix that. So I definitely do recommend you practice this step alone and just practice getting your levels right before moving on to the later sections of this tutorial series. Because while this is a pretty simple concept and it's pretty easy to implement, it is the most important and fundamental factor in achieving a good mix and will take some practice before you start getting decent results. It's also essential to your understanding of other elements in mixing. Compression, EQ, and any other mixing effects will make a lot more sense if you have leveling down, and these effects are pretty much not very useful if you don't understand how to set the levels of your sounds to be where they should be. So definitely make sure you're happy with your ability in this area, or at least your knowledge and understanding of it, before moving on to the other sections of the tutorial. And there are some practice exercises I've made to really help you with this that I will discuss more a little bit later on.